The soft beep of the keycard echoed in the quiet lobby as Marcus Reed swiped it against the reader. He pushed the door open, but before he could step inside, 2 officers blocked his path. Their eyes scanned him head to toe, lingering on his casual hoodie and sneakers. "What are you doing here?" one officer asked sharply, his hand hovering near his belt. Marcus raised his hand slightly, his voice calm but firm. "I live here. I own this building," the second officer scoffed, stepping closer. "Sure you do." Marcus's jaw tightened as he gestured toward the registry near the desk. "Check the list. My name's Marcus Reed." The officers exchanged a glance, their postures stiffening. "We don't need your attitude," the first officer snapped. "Turn around." It didn't matter that he belonged here. To them, he was already out of place. "I'm not causing trouble," Marcus said evenly. "I'm going home." "Turn around," the second officer repeated, his tone sharper now. Marcus hesitated for a moment before complying, his hands still raised. Behind him, the lobby door creaked open as a resident stepped out and froze mid-step. "Everything okay, ma'am?" one officer asked her quickly, his tone shifting slightly. The woman clutched her purse tighter, her eyes darting between Marcus and the officers. I just needed air," she said quietly, before retreating into the elevator without another word. Her silence wasn't neutral. It was an accusation. Marcus turned his head slightly toward the officers as he spoke again calmly. "Call the building manager." "Save it," the second officer interrupted coldly as handcuffs snapped around Marcus's wrists. The handcuffs tightened around Marcus's wrists, the cold metal biting into his skin. He stood still, his posture straight, his dignity intact despite the humiliation. The officers exchanged another glance before one of them spoke sharply. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area," the first officer said, his tone dismissive. Marcus exhaled slowly, his voice calm but deliberate. "Suspicious?" he asked. "I'm not suspicious. I'm the owner." His words hung in the air, ignored. The second officer pulled out a notepad, scribbling something quickly before gesturing toward the door. "Let's go." It wasn't about proof. It was about perception. To them, I didn't belong. The elevator dinged softly as a resident stepped out, a middle-aged woman clutching a tote bag. She froze as she saw Marcus in handcuffs, her eyes darting between him and the officers. "Ma'am," one officer said quickly, his tone shifting slightly. "Do you know this man?" The woman hesitated, her grip tightening on her bag. Her gaze flickered to Marcus briefly before she shook her head. I don't think so," she murmured, before stepping back into the elevator without another word. Her silence wasn't fear. It was complicity. Marcus turned his head slightly toward the officers again, his voice steady despite their dismissive tone. "Check the registry," he said firmly. "My name is Marcus Reed." The first officer smirked faintly as he tightened his grip on Marcus's arm. "Let's see if your story holds up downtown." The click of the cuffs echoed again as they led him toward the exit. The lobby was quiet except for the sound of footsteps and the faint hum of fluorescent lights. Marcus Reed walked calmly between the 2 officers, his wrists bound in cuffs, his head held high. Residents began to gather, their faces a mix of confusion and discomfort. A young couple near the entrance whispered to each other. "Isn't that the guy who owns this place?" the man asked, his voice barely audible. "Kid," woman shrugged, her eyes darting toward Marcus and then back to her phone. "I don't know. Maybe." Her tone was hesitant, unsure whether to intervene or stay silent. The weight of injustice wasn't just in what was happening. It was in who chose to look away. One resident pulled out her phone and began recording quietly, her hands trembling, slightly as she focused on Marcus's calm demeanor. Others avoided eye contact entirely, their discomfort palpable as they shuffled toward the elevator or stepped outside. Marcus glanced briefly at the crowd, his expression unreadable but steady. He didn't speak, didn't plead. He simply walked with quiet dignity, despite the humiliation surrounding him. The first officer muttered under his breath as they reached the door. "You people always think you can get away with anything." Marcus turned his head slightly, meeting the officer's gaze for a brief moment. His voice was low but firm. "Make sure you're recording," he said to one of the residents holding up their phone. The officer scoffed but faltered slightly as more phones went up around them, capturing every step, every word. Marcus didn't need to shout. The silence around him spoke louder than any argument ever could. The cold metal of the cuffs bit into Marcus's wrists as he stood beside the patrol car, his calm demeanor unbroken despite the weight of the moment. The officers exchanged quiet mutters, their voices low but sharp. "You people always think you can get away with anything," the first officer muttered under his breath, his grip tightening slightly on Marcus's arm. Marcus turned his head, slowly, meeting the officer's gaze with quiet defiance. His voice was steady, deliberate. "Make sure you're recording," he said to a bystander holding up their phone. The officer scoffed, his smirk faltering as more phones went up around them. It wasn't just Marcus they were recording, it was the system that had protected moments like this for years. The second officer opened the patrol car door and gestured for Marcus to step inside. "Get in," he said curtly, avoiding eye contact as murmurs from the crowd grew louder. Marcus paused briefly, glancing at the small group gathered near the entrance of his building. Their expressions ranged from confusion to quiet outrage, but no one spoke. The silence wasn't indifference, it was judgment. As Marcus sat down in the back seat, he looked out at the building he had built from nothing, the place he had poured years of effort into creating. His gaze lingered on the lobby windows, where residents stood watching silently. The first officer slammed the door shut with a loud thud, breaking the stillness for a moment. Marcus didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His quiet command had already shifted control. The patrol car pulled away slowly, the faint hum of the engine filling the silence. Marcus sat in the back seat, his hands still cuffed, his posture straight. He stared out of the window at the building he had built from nothing, the place that was supposed to be a symbol of belonging and progress. This wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had been made to feel like they didn't belong in spaces they had earned. Behind him, the officers spoke in hushed tones, their words muffled but laced with irritation. "This is going to blow over," one of them muttered. "It always does." Marcus didn't react. His gaze remained fixed on the lobby where residents still stood, some with their phones raised, others frozen in uneasy silence. A young woman, near the entrance, whispered to herself, her voice barely audible, "This isn't right." The car turned a corner, and the building disappeared from view. Marcus closed his eyes briefly, exhaling slowly as he steadied himself. They could take him away in cuffs, but they couldn't take away what he had built, or what he stood for. The officers fell silent as they drove through the city streets, the weight of what had happened settling over them like a shadow. Marcus opened his eyes again and looked straight ahead, his expression calm but resolute. This wasn't the end. It was a beginning. They would know who he was soon enough. The camera lingered on Marcus's face as the car disappeared into the distance, leaving behind a building full of whispers and a community on the brink of change. Conflict development. Marcus Reed stood in his office, his fingers brushing the edge of a framed photo on his desk. The image showed a modest apartment building in a neighborhood most developers had abandoned. His assistant, Lena, paused in the doorway holding a stack of contracts. "You still keep that old thing?" she asked softly, nodding at the photo. Marcus smiled faintly. "Reminds me why I started." Lena set the contracts down. "The board's waiting for your decision on the downtown project." Marcus didn't look up. "Tell them I'm not selling to out-of-state investors. This city needs affordable housing, not more luxury condos." Lena hesitated. "They said they'll find someone else if you don't agree." Marcus finally met her gaze, his voice steady. "Let them try." From a working-class upbringing to a self-made millionaire, Marcus built spaces where people like him could feel safe. But beneath his success lay quiet battles, denied loans, dismissive boardrooms, and assumptions about his competence. Lena sighed. They don't think you'll walk away. Marcus picked up the photo, his jaw tightening. They're wrong. Marcus sat in the small interrogation room, his wrists sore from the handcuffs that had only been removed minutes earlier. The fluorescent light buzzed faintly above him, casting harsh shadows on the gray walls. Across the table, 2 officers reviewed his documents, their smug expressions unshaken despite the deed clearly proving Marcus owned the building. One officer leaned back in his chair, tossing the papers onto the table carelessly. So, you're saying you own the place? Marcus's voice was calm but firm. I'm not saying it. The paperwork says it. The second officer smirked faintly, crossing his arms. You didn't even try to explain yourself back there, Marcus Mach raised an eyebrow. I did explain. You didn't listen. This wasn't about proof, it was about perception. To them, I was already guilty. The first officer leaned forward slightly, his tone sharp. You didn't even show an ID when we asked. Marcus exhaled deeply, his frustration masked by restraint. You didn't ask for ID. The officer's smirk faltered for a moment before he recovered quickly. We don't need your attitude right now. Marcus stared at him silently for a long moment before speaking again, his voice steady but deliberate. You arrested me, without verifying who I was or why I was there. That's not protocol. It's profiling. The second officer shifted uncomfortably in his seat but said nothing. They weren't used to being challenged, not by someone like me. The first officer stood abruptly, gathering the papers without another word. Marcus watched him carefully, his composure unbroken despite the weight of the moment. The video spread across social media like wildfire. Marcus Reed, calm and composed, stood in handcuffs outside his own building, stating clearly, I own this building. The officer's dismissive replies, Sure you do, played on repeat, their arrogance laid bare for millions to see. The world wasn't just watching, they were reacting. Under hashtags like Nashoner while black and Justice for Marcus, the video racked up thousands of comments within hours. This is why we need change, one user wrote. Another added, How many times does this happen without cameras? News anchors debated the incident on live television. A panelist shook his head as the clip replayed behind him. This isn't an isolated event, he said firmly. It's a symptom of systemic racism in law enforcement. Marcus sat at his desk, his phone buzzing with notifications. Messages poured in from activists, reporters, and strangers offering support. He scrolled through the comments silently, his expression unreadable but steady. They tried to make me invisible, but now they can't look away. A knock at the door broke the silence. Lena stepped in hesitantly, holding her phone out toward Marcus. You've seen this, right? She asked softly. Marcus nodded once. It's everywhere. Lena hesitated before speaking again. They're calling for accountability, for the officers and the department. Marcus leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply as he stared at the screen. Good, he said quietly. What began as one man's humiliation had sparked something bigger, a movement that couldn't be ignored. The news segment opened with a familiar face, a retired black teacher named Evelyn Harris. She sat in her modest living room, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her voice steady but tinged with pain. They treated me like I was nothing, she said softly, her gaze fixed on the camera. I was walking home from school carrying papers for my students, and they stopped me. Said I looked suspicious. Evelyn wasn't alone. Her story was one of many buried under the weight of systemic failure. The segment cut to a leaked memo from the police department showing complaints against the same officers dismissed as unfounded. Evelyn's case was among them. The reporter's voice carried through the screen. Patterns of racial profiling and excessive force have been linked to these officers for years, yet no action was taken. Marcus watched the interview quietly from his office, his jaw tightening as Evelyn's words replayed in his mind. The system didn't just fail, it protected those who perpetuated harm. A knock at the door broke his focus. Lena stepped in, holding a folder marked "Legal." "More complaints are coming to light," she said, handing it to Marcus. "People are speaking up." Marcus opened the folder slowly, scanning the pages filled with names and dates. His voice was low but deliberate. "They've been doing this for years." Lena nodded. "And getting away with it." Marcus closed the folder and set it aside, his resolve hardening. This wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about exposing what had been hidden for too long. The lobby was quiet when Marcus walked in, his steps deliberate, his wrists still sore from the hours spent in custody. Residents stood scattered near the entrance, their conversations hushed as they watched him return. Some avoided his gaze entirely, their discomfort palpable. A woman near the elevator hesitated before stepping forward. Her voice was soft, almost apologetic. "Mr. Reed, I'm sorry. I didn't know—" Marcus looked at her for a moment, his expression calm but unreadable. He nodded politely, offering no words in return. Her guilt wasn't enough. It wouldn't undo what had been done. Another resident approached cautiously, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "I saw the video," he said awkwardly. It's messed up what they did to you." Marcus raised an eyebrow slightly but said nothing. The man shifted uncomfortably under the weight of Marcus's silence before stepping back into the crowd. Their apologies weren't for him. They were for themselves, an attempt to ease their own discomfort. As Marcus moved toward the elevator, a young woman holding her phone whispered to her friend, "He didn't even get angry." Her friend nodded quietly. "He doesn't have to." The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and Marcus stepped inside alone. He turned to face the crowd as the doors began to close, his expression steady, composed. They could apologize all they wanted, but it wouldn't change what had happened or what needed to happen next. The doors shut with a quiet finality, leaving behind a lobby full of uneasy whispers and lingering guilt. The office was dim, the only light coming from the desk lamp as Marcus sat hunched over a stack of papers. Legal documents and handwritten notes were spread across the table, each one a piece of the puzzle he was trying to solve. His phone buzzed constantly, messages from reporters, activists, and lawyers flooding in. Marcus picked up his pen and scribbled something on a notepad. "They'll know who I am and what I stand for." He stared at the words for a moment before tearing the page off and setting it aside. This wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about exposing the system that allowed this to happen. A knock at the door broke his focus. Lena stepped in, hesitantly, holding a folder marked "Press." "The media wants a statement," she said softly. "They're asking if you'll do an interview." Marcus leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply as he rubbed his temples. "Not yet," he replied firmly. "I need to make sure everything's in place first." Lena nodded, but didn't leave immediately. "You've got people behind you," she said quietly. "It's not just about you anymore." Marcus glanced at her briefly before turning back to the papers. His voice was low but resolute. "That's why I can't mess this up." He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for everyone who had been silenced. Lena placed the folder on his desk and left without another word. Marcus stared at it for a long moment before picking up his phone and dialing a number. His voice was steady as he spoke. "Let's schedule the press conference." The newsroom buzzed with activity as reporters pieced together the growing story. On every screen, headlines blazed, "Racial profiling exposed, a system under fire." Clips of Marcus's arrest played on repeat, his calm voice echoing, "I own this building." The world wasn't just watching. They were asking questions. Inside, the police station, tension hung heavy in the air. Officers whispered in hallways, their words sharp but cautious. "This is bad," one muttered to another. "They're digging into everything." A leaked memo surfaced online, showing years of complaints dismissed as unfounded. The names of the arresting officers appeared repeatedly, tied to allegations of racial profiling and excessive force. One officer sat at his desk, staring at his phone as the news unfolded. He scrolled through comments under the video. "How many more have they done this to?" And this isn't just one bad apple. It's the whole tree. Power was easy to wield when it was protected, but now it was cracking under scrutiny. Marcus's lawyer released a statement to the press. This isn't an isolated incident, it's a pattern. And patterns like this don't happen without systemic failure. The media amplified the statement, sparking calls for accountability at every level. At his office, Marcus watched the coverage silently, his jaw tightening as more victims came forward with their stories. A young man recounted being stopped outside, in his workplace. They said I looked suspicious because I was wearing a hoodie. Each story added weight to the growing demand for change, and each one strengthened Marcus's resolve. The press conference room was packed, cameras flashing as reporters jostled for space. At the podium stood one of the officers involved in Marcus's arrest, his uniform crisp, but his expression strained. His hands gripped the edges of the podium, tightly, his knuckles white. We were following protocol, he began, his voice faltering slightly. A reporter raised her hand sharply. Why didn't you verify his identity before arresting him? The officer hesitated, his eyes darting. To the police chief standing silently at the side of the room. We believed there was a threat, he stammered. Believed? The reporter pressed. Based on what? Arrogance turned into desperation as public judgment closed in. The officer cleared his throat, trying to regain control. We responded to a call about suspicious activity. Another reporter cut him off. Suspicious because he was black? The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of the question hanging heavily in the air. The officer's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Silence wasn't just an answer, it was an admission. At the back of the room, Marcus sat quietly with his lawyer, watching the scene unfold. His expression was calm, composed, but his eyes held steady on the officer at the podium. The officer finally spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. We made a mistake. Confidence crumbled under scrutiny. Silence became their only defense. As Marcus stood to leave, reporters turned their cameras toward him, but he said nothing. His presence alone was enough to shift the focus, and the power. The interview room was quiet except for the faint hum of the camera recording. A young man sat across from the reporter, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. His voice was steady, but his words carried the weight of years of frustration. They said I looked suspicious because I was wearing a hoodie, he began, his eyes fixed on the floor. I was just trying to get to work. The reporter leaned forward slightly, her tone gentle but probing. Did you file a complaint? He shook his head, a bitter smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. What's the point? They don't listen to people like me. His story wasn't unique. It was one of many buried under a system designed to protect itself. The segment cut to another victim, an older woman with tired eyes and a voice that trembled as she spoke. They stopped me outside my own home, she said softly. Asked me if I lived there, like I didn't belong. Marcus watched these interviews from his office, his expression unreadable, but his jaw clenched tightly. Each story added to the growing chorus of voices that had been silenced for too long. This wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had been made to feel invisible. A knock at the door broke his focus. Lena stepped in, holding a list of names. More people are coming forward, she said quietly. They want to share their stories. Marcus nodded slowly, taking the list from her hands. His voice was low but resolute. Good. Let them speak. The voices that had been silenced were finally being heard, and they weren't stopping now. The hashtags, Justice for Marcus and End Profiling, trended across every platform, filling timelines with videos, stories, and calls for change. The clip of Marcus calmly stating, I own this building, while officers dismissed him, had become a rallying cry. What began as one man's humiliation had sparked a movement. Activists organized protests outside police headquarters, Crowds gathered with signs that read, "Accountability Now" and "Stop Racial Profiling." Chants echoed through the streets, their voices growing louder with every passing hour. Inside his office, Marcus scrolled through his phone, watching the momentum build. Videos of the protests flooded his feed. Young people holding up signs, older generations sharing their own stories of injustice. Comments poured in under each post. "This is what change looks like." "We're with you, Marcus." And "Enough is enough." It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had been dismissed, ignored, or erased. A news anchor's voice cut through the noise as Marcus switched to a live broadcast. "Lawmakers are now proposing new policies aimed at addressing racial profiling and increasing police accountability," she reported. "The Gaines initiative, inspired by Marcus Reed's story, is gaining national attention." Lena entered the room quietly, her expression a mix of exhaustion and pride. "They're listening," she said softly. Marcus nodded but didn't look up from his screen. His voice was calm but firm. "They have to." The system that once silenced voices was now being forced to listen, and it wasn't just hearing Marcus, it was hearing everyone. The courtroom was packed, the air heavy with tension. Marcus sat at the plaintiff's table, his posture straight, his expression calm but resolute. Across from him, the officers involved in his arrest sat stiffly, their confidence visibly shaken. The judge called for order as the trial began. Marcus's lawyer stood, holding up a stack of documents. "Your Honor, these are complaints filed against the defendants over the past 5 years, each one dismissed as unfounded." She placed them on the table with deliberate care. "This isn't an isolated incident, it's a pattern. The truth wasn't just being spoken, it was being laid bare." The defense lawyer rose quickly, his tone sharp but defensive. "There's no evidence to suggest racial bias in these actions. My clients followed protocol." Marcus's lawyer didn't flinch. She turned toward one of the officers. "Let's talk about protocol," she said evenly. "Why didn't you verify Mr. Reed's identity before arresting him?" The officer hesitated, his eyes darting toward his lawyer before he stammered, We believed there was a threat." "Believed?" she pressed. "Based on what?" Silence filled the room as the officer struggled to answer. Confidence crumbled under scrutiny. Silence became their only defense. The lawyer stepped closer, her voice steady but cutting. "Do you believe Mr. Reed didn't belong there because of how he looked?" The officer's jaw tightened as he muttered, "I don't recall." Marcus watched quietly, his composure unbroken despite the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about accountability, it was about dismantling the system that allowed this to happen. The night was quiet, the city lights casting a soft glow over the streets below. Marcus stood outside his building, his hands in his pockets, watching residents come and go. A young couple walked past him, laughing softly as they carried groceries. An older man nodded at Marcus as he passed, his expression warm but reserved. This wasn't just about justice, it was about reclaiming spaces where dignity could thrive. Marcus's gaze shifted upward to the building's nameplate, Reed Towers, shining brightly against the night sky. He exhaled deeply, the weight of the past weeks settling in his chest like a quiet storm. Behind him, Lena approached cautiously, holding a small stack of letters. "These came for you," she said softly, handing them over. Marcus flipped through them slowly, messages of support, handwritten notes from strangers thanking him for speaking up. One letter caught his attention, a simple card with 3 words scrawled across it in bold handwriting. "You gave hope." He stared at the card for a long moment before slipping it into his pocket. "It's not enough," he said quietly, almost to himself. Lena tilted her head slightly. "Maybe not yet," she replied, "but it's a start. They tried to make me invisible. But now, they can't look away." As Lena walked back toward the building, Marcus lingered outside for a moment longer. He whispered softly, almost inaudibly, "They'll never forget who I am." The camera panned, upward once more to the glowing nameplate, steady and unchanging, a symbol of resilience and belonging that no one could take away. Marcus stood behind the podium, his hands resting lightly on its edges. The crowd stretched across the street, a sea of signs reading "Justice for Marcus" and "End Racial Profiling." The buzz of murmurs and chants filled the air, but Marcus remained composed, his gaze steady as cameras zoomed in on him. He adjusted the microphone slightly, letting the noise settle before speaking. "This isn't just about me," he began, his voice calm but deliberate. "It's about everyone who has been made to feel like they don't belong in spaces they've earned." The crowd quieted, their attention sharpening as his words rippled through them. This wasn't about anger. It was about clarity. A woman near the front held up her phone, recording every word. Behind her, a man whispered to his friend, "He's not shouting." "Why isn't he shouting?" Marcus continued, his tone unwavering. "Accountability isn't just about punishment. It's about change. It's about making sure this doesn't happen again." The murmurs stopped entirely now, replaced by focused silence. The crowd wasn't just listening. They were reflecting. A reporter raised her hand sharply. "Mr. Reed, do you think this was a personal attack?" Marcus paused briefly before answering, his gaze steady on her. "This isn't personal. It's systemic." Another reporter called out, "What changes do you want to see?" Marcus leaned forward slightly, his voice carrying weight without volume. "I want to see a system where dignity isn't conditional, where belonging isn't questioned because of how someone looks." The reporters pressed forward, their voices overlapping as they fired questions at Marcus. Cameras flashed, microphones were held out, and the air buzzed with urgency. Marcus stood firm behind the podium, his hands steady on its edges, his expression calm despite the chaos. "Do you think this was a personal attack?" one reporter asked sharply, her tone cutting through the noise. Marcus paused, his gaze steady, as he met her eyes. "This isn't personal. It's systemic," he replied, his voice measured but deliberate. Another reporter chimed in quickly. "What changes do you want to see?" Marcus leaned forward slightly, his tone unwavering. "Accountability starts with recognizing the problem," he said. "We need systems that protect people, not assumptions that punish them." The crowd wasn't just hearing him. They were beginning to understand. A third reporter raised her voice from the back of the room. "Do you believe racial profiling is widespread in law enforcement?" Marcus exhaled deeply before answering. "It's not about belief," he said calmly. "It's about evidence, and there's plenty of it." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder as his words sank in. A woman near the front whispered to her friend, "He's not backing down." Her friend nodded quietly, her expression thoughtful. "He's making them think." Marcus glanced at the crowd briefly before continuing, "This isn't just about me. It's about everyone who has been dismissed, ignored, or made to feel invisible." Marcus didn't raise his voice to be heard. He used restraint to make them listen. As the reporters continued their questions, Marcus stood firm, his composure unshaken despite the weight of their scrutiny. The hallway at the police station was unusually quiet, the usual hum of chatter replaced by whispered conversations. Officers passed each other with hurried steps, their eyes avoiding contact. At the far end, one of the officers involved in Marcus's arrest sat alone at his desk, staring blankly at a pile of paperwork. Two younger officers walked past him, their voices low but sharp. "They really messed up this time," one muttered. The other glanced over his shoulder before replying, "Yeah, and now we're all under a microscope because of them." Power was easy to wield when it was protected, but now it was cracking under scrutiny. The officer at the desk shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his confidence visibly shaken. He glanced at his phone, scrolling through headlines that seemed to scream at him, "Racial profiling scandal rocks local police department." The video of Marcus's arrest played on loop beneath the headline, his calm voice echoing, "I own this building." A senior officer entered the hallway, his expression grim as he handed out folders marked "Internal Review." He stopped briefly at the desk of the officer involved. "You'll need to prepare a statement." he said curtly before walking away without waiting for a response. The officer opened the folder with trembling hands, scanning its contents. Complaints against him and his partner stared back at him. Cases dismissed as unfounded. Names he barely remembered, but could no longer ignore. The silence around him wasn't just judgment, it was isolation. As the whispers grew louder in the hallway, the officer slumped slightly in his chair, his authority shrinking under the weight of accountability. The small, sterile room was filled with tension. One of the officers involved in Marcus's arrest sat across from an investigator, his hands clasped tightly on the table. The investigator flipped through a thick file, her movements slow and deliberate, the silence stretching uncomfortably between them. "Let's start with the basics," she said finally, her tone calm but firm. "Why didn't you verify Mr. Reed's identity before arresting him?" The officer shifted in his seat, his confidence faltering for the first time. We had a call about suspicious activity," he stammered. The investigator raised an eyebrow. "Suspicious because he was entering his own building?" He hesitated, his eyes darting toward the door as if searching for an escape. "We believed there was a threat," he said weakly. "Believed?" she pressed, leaning forward slightly. "Based on what?" The officer's jaw tightened as he struggled to respond. "He didn't look like he belonged there," he admitted quietly, his voice barely audible. His arrogance, once so unshakable, was unraveling under the weight of his own words. The investigator nodded slowly, her expression neutral but piercing. "So you assumed," she said evenly. The officer's shoulders slumped slightly, his hands tightening into fists on the table. I made a mistake," he muttered, the words bitter in his mouth. Assumptions weren't enough to shield him anymore. They were only exposing him further. The investigator closed the file with a quiet snap and stood up. "Mistakes have consequences," she said simply before walking out of the room, leaving the officer alone with his unraveling confidence. The video of Marcus's arrest continued to dominate social media, shared under hashtags like "Where's Justice for Marcus" and "We End Profiling." The clip of Marcus calmly stating, "I own this building," while officers dismissed him, had become a symbol of quiet resistance. Marcus's restraint wasn't just a reaction, it was a catalyst. Protests erupted outside police headquarters. Crowds gathered with signs that read, "Accountability now," and "Stop racial profiling." Chants filled the air, their voices growing louder as more people joined. Inside his office, Marcus watched the footage on his phone. Streams of protesters marched through the streets, their determination palpable. Comments flooded in under the videos. "This happens every day. We need accountability. Marcus is fighting for all of us, and enough is enough." Lena entered quietly, holding a stack of papers. "The media is asking for another statement," she said softly. Marcus didn't look up immediately, his gaze fixed on the screen. "What are they saying?" "They're calling this a movement," Lena replied. "People are organizing protests in other cities now." Marcus exhaled deeply, setting his phone down. His voice was calm but resolute. "Good. Let them keep pushing." This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had been dismissed, ignored, or erased. A news anchor's voice cut through the noise as Marcus switched to a live broadcast. "Lawmakers are now proposing new policies aimed at addressing racial profiling and increasing police accountability," she reported. The Gaines Initiative, inspired by Marcus Reed's story, is gaining national attention. What began as one man's humiliation had sparked something bigger, a movement that couldn't be ignored. The camera focused on a young woman sitting in a modest living room, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her voice was steady, but her words carried the weight of years of frustration. "They stopped me outside my office," she said softly, her gaze fixed on the floor. "I was wearing a hoodie because it was cold, and they said I looked suspicious." The reporter leaned forward, slightly, her tone gentle but probing. "Did you file a complaint?" The woman shook her head, a bitter smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "What's the point? No one listens to people like me." Her story wasn't unique. It was one of many that had been ignored for far too long. The segment cut to an older man with tired eyes and a voice that trembled as he spoke. "They stopped me on my way home from work," he said quietly. "Asked me if I lived in my own neighborhood. I've lived there for 30 years. Marcus watched these interviews from his office, his expression steady but his jaw clenched tightly. Each story added to the growing chorus of voices that had been silenced for too long, captured his thoughts. This wasn't just about his story. It was about everyone who had been made to feel invisible. A knock at the door broke his focus. Lena stepped in, holding a list of names. "More people are coming forward," she said, softly. "They want to share their stories." Marcus nodded slowly, taking the list from her hands. His voice was low but resolute. "Good. Let them speak." The echoes of their voices were growing louder, and they weren't going to stop now. The courtroom was silent, the air thick with tension. Marcus sat at the plaintiff's table, his posture straight, his expression calm but resolute. Across from him, the officers involved in his arrest avoided his gaze, their confidence visibly eroded. Marcus's lawyer stood, holding up a stack of documents. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady but firm, "these are complaints filed against the defendants over the past 5 years, each one dismissed as unfounded." She placed them on the table with deliberate care. "This isn't an isolated incident. It's a pattern." The defense lawyer rose quickly, his tone sharp but defensive. "There's no evidence to suggest racial bias in these actions. My clients followed protocol." Marcus's lawyer didn't flinch. She turned toward one of the officers, her gaze piercing. "Let's talk about protocol," she said evenly. "Why didn't you verify Mr. Reed's identity before arresting him?" The officer hesitated, his hands tightening into fists under the table. We believed there was a threat," he stammered. "Believed?" she pressed, stepping closer. "Based on what?" The officer's jaw tightened as he struggled to respond. His voice was barely above a whisper. "He didn't look like he belonged there." Confidence crumbled under scrutiny. Silence became their only defense. The lawyer leaned in slightly, her tone cutting through the officer's discomfort. "Do you believe Mr. Reed didn't belong there because of how he looked?" The officer lowered his head, muttering, "I don't recall." Marcus watched quietly, his composure unbroken despite the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about accountability. It was about dismantling the system that allowed this to happen. The hashtags Shocker Justice for Marcus and Cockers End Profiling continued to dominate social media, sparking conversations across the country. Videos of protests flooded timelines, crowds chanting, holding signs that read, "Reform Now" and "Stop Racial Profiling." Marcus's story had become a rallying cry for change. What began as one man's humiliation had sparked a movement. In a televised debate, lawmakers discussed new policies inspired by Marcus's case. "The Gaines Initiative," one senator explained, "will require mandatory bias training for law enforcement and establish independent oversight committees for complaints." The anchor nodded, her tone sharp but hopeful. "Do you think this will pass?" Marcus watched the broadcast from his office, his phone buzzing with messages from activists and reporters. Lena entered quietly, holding a folder marked Community Outreach. "They're asking if you'll speak at the next rally," she said softly. Marcus didn't look up immediately, his gaze fixed on the screen. "What's the turnout?" Lena hesitated before answering. "Thousands, and it's growing every day." Marcus exhaled deeply, setting his phone down. His voice was calm, but resolute. Let them keep pushing. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had been dismissed, ignored, or erased. Outside police headquarters, protesters continued to march, their chants echoing through the streets. A young woman held up a sign that read, "We're not invisible." Beside her, an older man raised his fist silently, his expression filled with quiet determination. The system that once silenced voices was now being forced to listen, and it wasn't just hearing Marcus, it was hearing everyone. The police station was unusually quiet, the tension hanging heavy in the air. Officers moved through the hallways quickly, their eyes avoiding contact with one another. In the corner of the room, one of the officers involved in Marcus's arrest sat alone at his desk, staring blankly at a pile of unresolved complaints marked "Dismissed." He flipped through the files mechanically, his hands trembling slightly. As he read the names and dates, each one a reminder of decisions made too easily, too carelessly, whispers from nearby officers reached his ears. "They thought they were untouchable," one voice said quietly. Another replied, "Not anymore." The officer's jaw tightened as he looked up briefly. His colleagues avoided his gaze, their judgment clear in their silence. He sank deeper into his chair, the weight of isolation pressing down on him. In a nearby office, Marcus's lawyer reviewed documents with a team of investigators. "These patterns aren't just negligence," she said, firmly. "They're deliberate choices to ignore accountability." Her words carried through the thin walls, reaching ears that had once dismissed them as irrelevant. The officer at the desk closed the file slowly, his hands resting on its cover for a moment before pushing it aside. He stared at the empty space in front of him, his confidence eroded by the growing whispers and quiet judgment around him. In that silence, power shifted, not with confrontation, but with restraint. The building lobby was quiet, bathed in the soft glow of overhead lights. Marcus walked through slowly, his steps deliberate, his presence steady. Residents passed him, some nodding politely, others offering small smiles. A young boy tugged at his mother's sleeve as they waited for the elevator. "Is that Mr. Reed?" he asked in a whisper. His mother glanced at Marcus briefly before nodding. "Yes," she replied softly. "He owns the building." Marcus paused near the entrance, his gaze shifting to the nameplate above the doors. Reed Towers. The letters gleamed brightly against the night sky, a quiet but powerful reminder of everything he had built. He exhaled deeply, his thoughts steady, but heavy. This wasn't just about justice. It was about reclaiming spaces where dignity could thrive. Behind him, Lena approached cautiously, holding a small stack of letters. "These came for you," she said quietly, handing them over. Marcus flipped through them slowly, messages of support from strangers, handwritten notes thanking him for speaking up. One letter caught his attention. A simple card with 3 words scrawled across it in bold handwriting. "You gave hope." He stared at the card for a long moment before slipping it into his pocket. His voice was low but firm as he spoke, almost to himself. "It's not enough." Lena tilted her head slightly, her tone thoughtful. "Maybe not yet," she replied, gently. "But it's a start." Marcus lingered near the entrance for a moment longer before stepping outside into the cool night air. He whispered softly under his breath, "They'll never forget who I am." The camera panned upward to the glowing nameplate, steady and unchanging, a symbol of resilience that no one could take away. The chief tossed 2 envelopes onto the table with a heavy sigh. The officers stared at them, the silence stretching until one finally reached out and picked him up. "Effective immediately," the chief said flatly. The first officer tore the envelope open, his hands trembling slightly as he scanned the letter. "Suspended? For what?" The chief's gaze hardened. "You know damn well for what." The second officer crumpled his letter without reading it. "This is bullshit." The chief leaned forward, his voice low but sharp. "You had complaints stacking up for years. You ignored them. Now they're ignoring you." The first officer scoffed. "We were doing our jobs." "Your jobs?" The chief stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Your job was to protect people, not profile them." The officers exchanged a glance, their confidence fraying at the edges. The first officer muttered under his breath, "This isn't fair." But the words dissolved into the stifling silence. The chief walked out, leaving the door open behind him. The second officer stared at the crumpled letter, his badge gleaming, faintly under the fluorescent lights. "They're scapegoating us," he said quietly. The first officer shook his head, his voice hollow. "We're the scapegoats because we got caught." The officer stood at the front of the room, his resignation letter folded neatly in his hand. The station was quiet, the usual hum of activity replaced by an uneasy stillness. His colleagues sat scattered around the room, avoiding his gaze, their expressions unreadable but heavy with judgment. "I made mistakes," he said finally, his voice breaking the silence. No one responded. The words hung in the air like smoke, lingering but offering no clarity. He cleared his throat, trying to steady himself. I thought I was doing my job." A junior officer near the back shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Your job?" he muttered under his breath, loud enough for others to hear, but not loud enough to challenge directly. The officer's grip on the letter tightened as he glanced around the room. "I didn't mean for things to get this far," he said, his tone softer now, almost pleading. Still, no one spoke. It wasn't accountability. It was survival. He placed the resignation letter on the desk and stepped back slowly, his shoulders slumped under the weight of his own words. As he walked toward the door, his colleagues avoided looking at him directly. Their silence wasn't neutral. It was judgment. He paused briefly at the doorway and glanced back once, as if searching for some shred of acknowledgement or understanding. But no one looked up. The badge that once gave him power now felt like a burden. Without another word, he left the station for the last time, his footsteps echoing faintly down the hallway. The hallway was filled with quiet tension, the kind that lingered after something had gone terribly wrong. Officers passed each other quickly, their voices hushed, their glances fleeting. Two junior officers stood near the break room, their conversation barely above a whisper. They brought this on themselves, one said, shaking his head. The other leaned against the wall, his expression grim. We all knew it was wrong. Their words carried through the hallway, reaching ears that pretended not to listen, but couldn't ignore them. The suspended officers sat at their desks, isolated by silence and judgment. One of them stared blankly at his computer screen, the cursor blinking on an empty report he couldn't bring himself to write. The system wasn't just cracking, it was shifting. Another officer walked past, her footsteps deliberate but quiet. She glanced briefly at the suspended officers before turning away, her lips pressed into a thin line. The whispers grew louder as more people passed through the hallway, their unease palpable. They thought they were untouchable. "Someone," muttered near the copy machine. A colleague nodded silently, his expression heavy with quiet agreement. "Not anymore." One of the suspended officers slammed his pen down on the desk, the sound sharp but hollow in the stillness. He looked around as if daring someone to speak directly to him, but no one did. It wasn't anger, it was regret disguised as defiance, as the whispers continued to echo through the hallway. He sank deeper into his chair, his authority shrinking under the weight of accountability. The protests outside the police headquarters had grown larger, stretching across the street and spilling into nearby parks. Signs reading, "Stop Racial Profiling" and "Justice for All" waved in the air as chants echoed through the crowd. People of all ages marched together, their voices steady, their determination unshakable. Inside a legislative chamber, lawmakers debated new policies inspired by Marcus's case. One senator stood at the podium, his tone firm but measured. "The Gaines Initiative," he explained, "will require mandatory bias training for law enforcement and establish independent oversight committees for complaints. This is how we begin to rebuild trust." In his office, Marcus watched the live broadcast on his laptop. The senator's words carried through the screen, blending with footage of protesters marching through the streets. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his fingers resting lightly on the edge of his desk. Change didn't come from anger, it came from exposure. Lena entered quietly, holding a folder marked Community Outreach. She placed it on the desk and spoke softly. "They're asking if you'll speak at the next rally." Marcus didn't look up immediately, his gaze fixed on the screen. "What's the turnout?" "Thousands," Lena replied, "and it's growing every day." Marcus exhaled deeply, setting his laptop aside. "Let them keep pushing," he said calmly. Outside the building, a young woman held up a sign that read, "We're not invisible." Beside her, an older man raised his fist in silent solidarity, his expression filled with quiet determination. The system that once silenced voices was now being forced to listen, and it wasn't just hearing Marcus. It was hearing everyone. The lobby of Reed Towers was alive with quiet conversations and hesitant smiles. Residents and community members gathered in small groups, their voices low but purposeful. Marcus stood near the center, his presence steady as he listened to each person who approached him. A young woman stepped forward, clutching a notebook tightly to her chest. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said softly. For standing up? For all of us." Marcus nodded, his expression calm but warm. "This building was always meant to be more than just walls," he replied. "It's a place where everyone should feel like they belong." Nearby, an older man spoke to a small group of residents. "We need to start looking out for each other," he said firmly. "If we don't, who will?" Marcus glanced toward him, a faint smile crossing his face. He could see the shift happening, not just in the room, but in the hearts of the people around him. He wasn't just rebuilding trust, he was building something better. Lena approached with a clipboard in hand, her voice low but urgent. "The press is asking for a statement," she said. Marcus shook his head slightly. "Not tonight," he replied. "This isn't about me, it's about them." He turned back to the crowd, watching as neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now exchanged ideas and shared stories. A child ran past him, laughing as she chased another through the open space. Marcus exhaled deeply, his resolve steady. This wasn't just about justice, it was about creating a community where dignity could thrive. As the evening continued, the room grew warmer, not from the lights, but from the quiet connections being made. The police station felt colder than usual, the hum of activity now replaced by an eerie quiet. The desks of the suspended officers sat empty, their nameplates removed, leaving behind only faint outlines where their titles once were. A junior officer walked past, his footsteps echoing softly in the stillness. He glanced at one of the empty desks and whispered to a colleague nearby. They thought they were untouchable. The colleague nodded silently, his expression heavy with judgment. "And now look at them," he muttered. The suspended officer's absence lingered like a shadow over the station. In the corner, one officer sat alone at his desk, staring blankly at a pile of unresolved complaints marked "Dismissed." His hands hovered over the files, but he couldn't bring himself to open them. A senior officer walked by without stopping, his gaze fixed forward as if refusing to acknowledge the weight of what had happened. The junior officer leaned closer to his colleague and whispered again, "It's like they don't even exist anymore." The officer at the desk finally reached for one of the files, flipping it open slowly. He scanned the names and dates, each one a reminder of decisions made too easily, too carelessly. His grip tightened on the paper as whispers from nearby officers reached his ears. "They deserve this," someone said quietly near the break room. Another voice replied, "Maybe it'll make the rest of us think twice." The officer closed the file abruptly and pushed it aside. He sank deeper into his chair, his authority shrinking under the weight of accountability. In that silence, power had shifted, not with confrontation, but with quiet judgment. The office was dimly lit, the glow of Marcus's phone illuminating his face as he scrolled through endless messages. Comments flooded his inbox, each one carrying a different tone. Gratitude, anger, hope. "You're an inspiration," one message read. Another said, "Thank you for speaking up. It's about time someone did." Marcus paused at a longer message from a young woman. "I've been afraid to speak out for years. Watching you stand your ground gave me the courage to share my story. Thank you." For years, Marcus had been made to feel invisible. But now, his voice was impossible to ignore. Lena entered quietly, her footsteps soft against the carpet. She held a stack of letters in her hands and placed them on his desk without saying a word. Marcus glanced at her briefly before picking up the top envelope. Inside was a handwritten note. "You gave people like me hope. Don't stop now." Marcus set the letter down carefully, his fingers lingering on its edge. He exhaled deeply, his thoughts steady but heavy. Lena spoke softly, breaking the silence. "They're listening to you, Marcus," she said. "Not just here. Everywhere." Marcus nodded slowly but didn't look up from the letters. "It's not just about me," he replied quietly. "It's about all of us." He leaned back in his chair and stared at the stack of letters for a long moment before picking up another envelope. Each word he read felt heavier than the last, but it also carried something else: resolve. The messages weren't just support. They were reminders that change was possible. The lobby of Reed Towers was calm, the soft hum of conversation blending with the faint sound of children laughing outside. Marcus walked through slowly, nodding briefly at residents who greeted him. Their smiles were small but genuine, their eyes meeting his in a way they hadn't before. A young boy tugged at his mother's sleeve as they stood by the elevator. "Is that Mr. Reed?" he asked in a hushed voice. His mother glanced at Marcus and nodded. "Yes," she said softly. "He owns the building." Marcus paused near the entrance, his gaze drifting toward the glass doors. Outside, children played freely on the sidewalk, their laughter echoing through the open space. He watched them for a moment, his expression calm but thoughtful. This wasn't just about justice. It was about reclaiming spaces where dignity could thrive. Behind him, an older woman approached cautiously, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Mr. Reed," she said quietly, her voice hesitant but warm, "I just wanted to say thank you." Marcus turned to her, offering a small nod. "We all deserve to feel safe where we live," he replied simply. She smiled faintly before stepping back into the crowd, her shoulders relaxing as she joined, a group of neighbors in quiet conversation. Marcus lingered near the entrance for a moment longer, watching as the community began to rebuild itself, not through grand gestures but through small connections and shared understanding. He exhaled deeply and stepped outside into the cool evening air. The world feels different now. Not perfect, but better. As he walked down the street, the sound of laughter and conversation followed him like a quiet promise of change. The penthouse was silent, the city skyline stretching out beyond the floor-to-ceiling. Windows. Marcus stood alone, his hands resting lightly on the edge of the glass as he gazed at the flickering lights below. The streets were alive with movement, cars passing, people walking, distant voices blending into the hum of the night. He exhaled slowly, his breath fogging the glass for a moment before fading. His reflection stared back at him, steady and composed, but beneath it lay years of struggle, quiet battles fought in boardrooms and neighborhoods where he was always seen as an outsider. They tried to make him invisible, but now they couldn't. "Look away." Marcus turned and walked toward his desk, where his phone buzzed softly with new notifications. He picked it up and scrolled through messages of support. "You've changed how people see things," one read. Another simply said, "Thank you for standing up." He set the phone down and glanced at the stack of letters Lena had left earlier. One envelope caught his eye, a handwritten note with bold, simple words. "You gave us hope." Marcus sat down slowly, turning the note over in his hands. His thoughts were steady but heavy, filled with memories of everything that had led to this moment. The humiliation, the silence, the quiet resolve that had carried him through it all. The skyline outside flickered softly as Marcus leaned back, in his chair. He whispered to himself, his voice barely audible, "They'll never forget who I am." The camera lingered on his reflection in the glass before panning out to the city below, a world that was beginning to change. The night was calm, the city bathed in a soft glow from streetlights and distant skyscrapers. Marcus stood outside Reed Towers, his hands in his pockets, gazing up at the building he had poured his life into. The nameplate above the entrance gleamed brightly. Reed Towers, a quiet but unshakable symbol of everything he had fought for. Residents passed him as they entered and exited the building, their movements unhurried, their expressions lighter than before. A young couple walked by, carrying groceries and laughing softly. An older man nodded at Marcus as he passed, his acknowledgment brief but warm. Marcus exhaled deeply, his thoughts steady but reflective. This wasn't just about justice, it was about reclaiming spaces where dignity could thrive. Behind him, Lena approached cautiously, holding a small stack of papers. "These came for you," she said softly, handing them over. Marcus flipped through the pages slowly. Letters of support, handwritten notes from strangers thanking him for speaking up. One card stood out. "You gave us hope." He stared at the card for a long moment before slipping it into his pocket. His voice was low but resolute as he spoke almost to himself. "It's not enough." Lena tilted her head slightly, her tone thoughtful but firm. "Maybe not yet," she replied gently. "But it's a start." Marcus lingered near the entrance for a moment longer before stepping back into the cool night air. He whispered softly, under his breath, "They'll never forget who I am." The camera panned upward to the glowing nameplate, steady and unchanging. A legacy reclaimed not just for Marcus, but for everyone who had been denied dignity and belonging for too long.